So we are starting with assignment number 52, our classwork, and the first category that we're going to go through is simplifying radicals with negative radicands. Let's click on the first one. And remember, we all have the exact same questions, so I want you to follow along with me as we do it together. We'll have the exact same answer. So we're going to write negative square root of 20 in simplest radical form. I think before we get started, well, I should have read through some of the notes with you. Okay, it's okay. I'll just explain it here in empty space. Okay, so I want you to think back on all the numbers that you know. You know, like fractions, you know, numbers that are whole numbers, you know, numbers like pi, right? These are all numbers that are called real numbers, okay? I'm going to write that down. All the numbers you know so far are real. And you're like, that just sounds really weird, Miss Jade. Of course they're real. Well, that's because we are about to introduce something called an imaginary number. Okay, so normally if I tell you to take the square root of a negative number, you would say that doesn't exist, right? You would say this doesn't exist. However, now we can take the square root of a negative number by knowing that the square root of, the square root of -1, the negative should have been inside, is something called I. And I, we're going to just call that the imaginary number. Sorry, I'm fixing the attendance. Okay, so square root of -1 is I, which is an imaginary number. So it's not a real number, it's an imaginary number. And that I know looks really weird, but essentially imaginary numbers are useful because they actually have a lot of applications in engineering. Maybe you won't have to use it per se, like in your future job, but if you want to go into engineering or robotics or anything of that field, you will have to deal with imaginary numbers. So I know that sounds really weird. How can a number be imaginary? But just for now, take our word for it that the square root of -1 is the letter I, which stands for the imaginary number, okay? So if the square root of -1 is I, that also means that I squared is -1. So these are like the important bits that you need to know right here, is that the square root of -1 is I, and I squared is -1. So keep that in mind. Yep, okay. So now let me zoom out. Or actually, before I zoom out, are there any questions? So we got a question that asked, does this mean every negative number is imaginary? So no, negative numbers are part of the real numbers. So negative numbers are all part of all the real numbers. But if you square root it, then it becomes imaginary. So the negative numbers are real, but their square roots become imaginary. All right, so now that we understand, or hopefully understand, that the square root of a negative is an imaginary number called I, we can use that, oh my God, I'm trying to zoom out. We can use that to take the square root of -20. So when you simplify radicals, you want to break it up into two parts. So I can write 20 as the product of two numbers, specifically -4 times 5, because -4 times 5 equals 20, right? And I know I could have written 20 as the product of 10 and 2, but I want to choose -4 and 5 because I know that 4 is a perfect square. Remember, perfect squares are like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, ... These are perfect squares because this is 1 squared, this is 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. So I chose a perfect square, 4. So -20 is rewritten as -4 times 5, and that gives you -20. So I broke down that -20 into -4 and 5. Okay, so the square root of 5 just stays the same as it is. However, the square root of -4, we can actually simplify that. So what is the square root of 4? Well, the square root of 4 is 2, but because this is a -4, we want to write 2i. So we have 2i times radical of 5. Okay, and then last but not least, when you write this imaginary number, if it has an I in it, it's imaginary. So when you want to write the imaginary number, you just want to rearrange it so the I is at the very end. So this is actually equal to 2 radical 5, and then an I on the outside of it. So 2 radical 5 I instead of 2i radical 5. Since it's all being multiplied together, remember you can multiply things in any order and it will still be the same. So I'm just going to bring the I to the back side, to the right side. And that's going to be our final answer. Are there any questions? So you type 2 radical 5, and then you want to make sure you press this arrow key so that your I is on the outside. And then to type the letter I, you can just use your computer's keyboard to type like the letter I. And then for me, I have to go find Delta Math's keyboard and then use the I here. But type your I after the radical, but not inside it. Okay, do you see how my I is not inside my radical? It's just outside. Okay, any questions? And then I want to submit this. So apparently I can be before the radical or after the radical. So either way, Delta Math accepts it. So that's good to know. So oops. So as you can see, Delta Math accepts if you put the I before or after the radical. But just the way I learned it is I should come at the end of the number all the time. But it's okay if you typed it like this, 2i radical 5. So if you do that, that's totally fine too, okay? So now we know. Okay, let's do another one. Next section. Remember, we have the exact same problems, so we can do this together. This is the second problem now. We have square root of -125. So I have to think to myself, what perfect square fits into this? Will it be 4? Will it be 9? Will it be 16? Will it be 25? Well, I see 25 in here, so I'm going to try a 25. And so if you use your calculator, you can find out that this is actually the product of -25 and 3. Wait, no, sorry, not 3. 5. And you can double check it on your calculator. If you try -25 times 5, does that indeed give you -125? And you're like, cool. And so it works. Then we're going to simplify this. This one stays the same. And what is the square root of -25? This will be, well, square root of 25 is 5. But because it's a negative, I have to add the letter I after it. And then we now know that I can stay before the radical, so we can just submit it like that. 5i radical 5. Just like this. Okay? 5i radical 5. Okay, so I'm gonna pause the video, see if you have any questions. So let's go ahead and submit it. 5i radical 5. Oops, 5. Remember, you can just type the letter I in your keyboard. So 5i radical 5. Okay, let's go to the next one. And then let's see, -128. Okay, so if you use your calculator, you can find out that -128 can be rewritten as the product of -16 times times +8. So on your calculator, try 16 times 8, and it'll give you 128. Oh, and -64 and 2. Oh, that's great. That's actually even better. I'm going to cross that out. And let's do -64. I have a habit of writing my negative outside the radical, apparently. Okay, so -64 and 2. If you multiply that together, it will give you -128. And then also, just so you know, if you went this way, it would just take us an extra step. But since Ellie thought of this way, this is even better. Okay, so radical 2 stays as radical 2. What is the square root of 64? 8. Good. And then because it's negative 64, what do I have to put after the 8? What letter, I guess? I, which stands for the imaginary number, because I is the square root of any -1. So I is the square root of -1. So after we square root a negative, I has to exist in our answer. So we have 8I radical 2. 8I radical 2. And that's what we're going to submit. Where do we get 2 again? Okay, so I got a question that says, where do we get the 2? So we are just thinking of what two numbers can multiply to -128. And then one of our students suggested -64 times 2. So if you try -64 and you multiply it by 2, you will get -128. So that's where the 2 came from. And so why are we choosing the -64 and 2? Well, you want to try to find the biggest perfect square that fits into -128. And remember, perfect squares are like 1 squared, which is 1, 2 squared, which is 4, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared, 6 squared, 7 squared, 8 squared, 9 squared. So you want to see if any of these numbers fit into the number they give us. And yes, you can play around with your calculator and then see if any of these fit. So like if I did 128 divided by 81, that'll give me some decimal. So I know that 81 does not fit into 128. And then you can try the 64. So I'll do 128 divided by 64. And then that gives me 2. And then since we know that 128 divided by 64 gives us 2, that means 64 times 2 will give us -128. And so we split it up from this into this. And then another question is, where do we get I? So I is the square root, let me write here, I is the square root of -1. So anytime you take a square root of a negative number, you're going to have I in there. So I is the imaginary number. Imaginary because normally we don't square root a negative number. So you know how like in previous classes, if you have the square root of a negative number, you just say no solution because I told you you can't square root a negative number. But now we've gotten to the point in math, we got advanced enough that we learned that we can use things called imaginary numbers. And I know that sounds completely useless, but I swear if you did not have imaginary numbers, if no one came up with that, you would not have the computer you're doing Zoom on. You would not have your phone that you're probably checking once in a while. So technology, all of that engineering stuff, the cars that you drive or that your parents drive, that people drive, all of it would not exist if no one came up with imaginary numbers. So that's what I is. And then so every time you take a square root of a negative number, you're going to get an I in your answer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and type this into my answer box, 8I radical 2. 8I radical 2. Okay, so I think we have one more simplifying radicals with negative radicands. Let me just check. Yes, one more of that category. Okay, rewrite negative square root of -245 in simplest radical form. Okay, so we have to think about what perfect squares can fit into -245. Okay, so I tried 25 and I got 9.8, so that's not going to fit. What about 9? 245 divided by 9? No, that doesn't work. Ellie says -49 and 5. Good. Okay, so let's split it up. We can try -49 multiplied by 5. And so remember, you're just playing around with your calculator a bit, testing out to see if any perfect square fits into the number they give you. So if you do 245 and you divide it by 49, you're going to get 5. And then that's the pairing that we want, the -49 and the 5. So the square root of 5 stays as it is. And what is the square root of -49? What should I write there? 7. Good. And because it is a negative, what letter do I have to write to represent our imaginary piece? because, okay, good, because you can't usually square root a negative. However, we are working with square roots of negatives, and so we have the imaginary number 7i square root of 5. And this is your final answer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and type that in. 7i square root 5. And we will submit this. Cool. Okay, any questions on this one?